I'm here really just to pass the torch to Alex O'Hara. We're very fortunate this year in the Celtic department to have Alex, who is such a well-known historian of late antique and early medieval Ireland in Europe, of the Irish presence in Europe, and particularly the master of all things to do with Columbanus and with Jonas, his biographer. And we would be more fortunate to have Alex with us for the year as a Fulbright Fellow as he is, if we weren't suffering still from the restrictions of the pandemic, but we're still hoping that those are going to lift, maybe even considerably, before your time runs out in the summer, Alex. But we've been very lucky in being able to have him with us at our talks and giving us talks. And now Alex has induced his collaborator, Justin Colvin, to speak with us as well. And I'm going to mute my mic and turn this over to Alex to introduce Justin. I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Justin. Nice to meet you. Hope there.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and to all the faculty in Celtic for facilitating this seminar and for your welcome. It's a delight for me to introduce my co-author, Justin Reaux Colvin, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, where he teaches in the language and culture tracks. Justin is a specialist in ethnic thinking in the late antique and early medieval Latin West, and he's taught courses on the barbarian migration, Celts as an ethnic category, interpretations of somatic difference in antiquity, modern receptions of Roman political ideation, ancient and late antique historiography, late Roman social history, and the uses of the natural sciences in the study of the pre-modern past. And we're currently working together, co-authoring a volume From Savagery to Sanctity and Back Again, Imagining Ireland, the Irish, and Irishness from Antiquity to the Coming of the English. So it's a delight for me to welcome Justin, who will be talking on Qua ex parte est Hibernia, Encountering Ireland, the Irish, and Irishness in Antiquity and Late Antiquity.
Okay. I'd like to thank Dr. O'Hara and the excellent people at Harvard Celtic, especially Professor Catherine McKenna, for the invitation to address y'all this evening. It's an honor to speak to people so fine at an institution so august, virtual though it may be. And I appreciate you, the attendees, for tuning into this talk this evening. What follows proceeds from a book project, the book project that Dr. O'Hara just mentioned. Ireland was known, if not well known, to Greek and Roman authors of antiquity. Our earliest authors term Ireland Irirne or Iwernia in Greek and Hibernia in Latin, yet nowhere, apart from the geographical reckonings of Ptolemy, do we encounter anything like granular details in our authors' passing mentions. Ireland was a terra incognita in the Mediterranean imaginary, conventionally unfamiliar locale onto which ancient ethnic thinkers projected their own anxieties, desires, and objectives, and thereby rhetorically freighting the place and its people and producing a realm of imagination and possibility, unencumbered by actuality. The imagination of ethnic thinkers in antiquity cast Ireland as especially barbaric, possessed of an imagined geography, an imagined ethnology, and an imagined menagerie. Hardly a bare topographical feature, Ireland was a cipher for barbarity in the Greek and Roman cultural imaginary, which framed Ireland as a total repository of alterity. Now, while geography formed a coherent ancient literary genre, ethnography never formed a distinct genre of its own. Even so, the two concepts, place and people, were inextricably linked in the imagination of ancient authors. As Greg Wolfe argues, the majority of the passages usually considered as ethnographic or geographic are in fact found within texts of other kinds. Immadench notes that ethnographic thought was intimately bound up to historical and geographical imaginings. Thus, rather than exploring ethnography and antiquity, we must be attuned to episodes of ethnic thinking in our sources. The ethnographic gaze of our authors was inescapable, and everywhere ethnic thinking peppers our sources. In words adapted from Nell Irvin Painter, ethnicity is an idea, not a fact. Being rooted in ideation rather than actuality, ethnicities are configured, instrumentalized, modified, and dissipated according to the rhetorical ambitions of the author describing them, and in response to the social exigencies of an author's own moment. Even so, the tendency when thinking about questions of ethnicity is to privilege the product of ethnic thought, that is, ethnicity itself, over the process of ethnic thinking, the discursive formation of ethnicities occasioned by ambition, anxiety, and iteration. As Michel M. Wright tells us, privileging what an ethnicity is, we lose sight of where, when, why, and for what purpose an ethnicity comes into being. While it is true heredity may exist in the blood, ethnicity exists in the head. And we should be reticent to reach through ancient ethnic thinking in order to grasp ethnicity. Ancient authors shared neither our methods, our frameworks, our preferences, nor our interests. Rather, we must understand that our authors give voice to contingent observations of outsiders. What we're left with are rhetorically configured perceptions of difference. This paper will make two interlinked claims. First, that the well-known geographical inconsistency of ancient reckonings of Ireland's emplacement on the surface of the earth, that is, where our authors physically locate the land, long thought to be simply topographic or typographic errors born of incomplete or erroneous knowledge, is actually reflective of a given author's ethnic ambition when describing Ireland. That is to say, locating Ireland to the north of Britain performs the rhetorical work of underlining the barbarity of the place. In contrast, locating Ireland to the southwest of Britain likewise civilizes the island and treats it as an object of empire. Second, once a baseline reckoning of Ireland's incivility is established, and this happened certainly before the turn of the 4th century CE, Ireland, the place, the Irish, the people, became a byword for barbaritatis in extremis, a simple, ready-to-hand comparandum for acute savagery, a quantity late antique and early medieval authors deployed in a rhetorical rather than a descriptive manner. So how did ancient authors reckon difference? Well, already in the 5th century BC, Herodotus gives us an approximate definition for ethnicity. When recording the rationale for pan-Hellenic coalition building in advance of the Second Persian invasion of Greece, the Athenians remind the Spartan envoys that customs in kind must present a united front, writing, again, there is the Hellenica, the common blood, the common language, the temples and sacrifices in common, the likeness of our life ways and customs. Herodotus here argues for Hellenic commonality and what he seems to regard as the essentials. These four.
Justin,
yes.
sorry to interrupt. The slides don't seem to be showing. Just check that.
I am certainly screen sharing. Can you see this?
You're screen sharing, but we're not. There's nothing on the screen.
I think you need to click on.
Allow me to try this.
Yeah,
there
we go.
There you go.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. I'm very sorry about that. It is a Zoom conspiracy. Thank you very much, Alex, for letting me know. These four poles, descent, language, religion, and custom, might usefully form an ancient tetrad of perceived ethnic distinction. Writing 100 years later, Aristotle simplifies this rubric numerically, though complicates it conceptually, arguing that nature, custom, and language made a people. But these schemata tell us only about the metrics by which ancients perceived distinction, not the processes by which difference was actuated. In order to determine how ancients framed ethnogenesis, that is the coming into being of ethnic groups in time and place, we must turn to ancient notions of ethnic formation, which they regarded as a constituent element of geographical reckoning. The Greek and Roman ethnological imagination was animated by a concern with geography and the environment. Their theories of difference were predicated on a totalizing theoretical intervention, which maintained that distinctions in human physiology and culture proceeded from environmental constraints on humorial balance and constitution. In the early 4th century BC, an author contributing to the Hippocratic corpus could write, "Climate then is the greatest factor in diversity among people, because all things that grow on the earth follow the example of the earth itself," an aphorism which explains that in general, you will find both the physique and the characteristics of the inhabitants follow the nature of the land. For this reason, other people of Europe differ from one another in both stature and shape because of the changes of the seasons. And among these variations, the tribes differ from one another in stature, shape, and courage. So people in their myriad and multiplicitous diversities were products of the land. The land itself was a conditioning condition. When an ancient Greek or Roman wished to comprehend the etiology of cultural difference, that observer would look to the land. So variations in climate engendered human variation. According to Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, these variations arise owing to the fact that ethnic character is determined according to the general parallels and angles by their position relative to the zodiac cycle and the sun. That is to say, the perceived heat, the perceived effect of heat and moisture on the climate of a given locale. Of course, Greeks and Romans are cited at a happy medium. According to Vitruvius, the Roman people are positioned in the direct center of the entire world, and Pliny the Elder. In the middle of the world, there is a healthy mixture of heat and cool. The inhabitants are moderate of body and quite temperate with respect to complexion. We find gentle customs, clear thoughts, and fertile minds capable of understanding all of nature. Geopolitical hegemony is attributed to this favorable locale. Empires likewise occur in the middle. Empires have never arisen among the most remote gentes. This thinking appears to have been remarkably durable, appearing later in the works of Galen, Vegetius, and Isidore of Seville, and surviving well into the medieval and early modern periods. It would not be too much to say that the environmental theory of difference was something like the predominant ethnogenetic model in antiquity. And these differences were magnified at the climatological extremes of the oikoumene. Aristotle tells us that the extremes of climate, the cold north and the hot south, engender extremes in somatic variation, and proceeding from the climatic condition of character, cultural variation as well. Writing in the 1st century CE, Strabo tells us that if we divide the spaces of the heavens into 4 zones, the Indians hold that part from which the east wind blows. The Ethiopians, the part from which the south wind blows, the Celts, the part on the west, and the Scythians, the part from which the north wind blows. This tetrad formed the 4 extremes on the fringes of the habitable world. Benjamin Isaac has noted that collective characteristics were determined by climate. The implication is that changes come from the outside and will remain stable and do not occur through evolution or conscious choice. Large groups of people, indeed entire nations, are believed to have common characteristics determined outside themselves, which are, by implication, unchangeable. In climatic extremes, the ancients saw the extremes of human variation. Elsewhere, Isaac characterizes this thinking as a core periphery model, which is exactly right. The perceived normalcy of the core is defined by the extremity of the periphery. And this mutually constitutive relationship, in a sense, propelled ethnographic projects in antiquity. So ethnic difference at its core was a question of geography. For ancients, the environment conditioned distinct cultures into being. Turning to perceptions of Ireland, we can see this dynamic in action. The land and its people were superlative, both the furthest removed periphery from the Mediterranean center and also the most barbarous. Of course, our authors have no firsthand familiarity with Ireland and its people. Rather, their perceptions of both place and people fit within the interpretive schema of their own moment, just as one would expect to find. Ireland was described and interpreted according to ancient methods for measuring social distinction, theoretical explanations that account for those differences, and the rationale that extreme remove engenders extreme difference. As Ralph Moore and Philip Freeman note, the exact site of Ireland varies in the attestation of our earliest authors, though always described in its proximity to Britain. Ireland literally wheels around its larger neighbor, sometimes being described as north of Britain, so for example, Strabo and Pomponius Mela, sometimes being described as west of Britain, so for example, Caesar, and sometimes being described as lying between Britain and Spain, so for example, Tacitus. As we will see, locating Ireland geographically inflects descriptions of the island ethnologically. And we are nowhere privileged to a humoral array that would locate Ireland in the ancient chain of being advanced from humoral principles. We can look to the placement of Ireland alleged in our authors and reckon back from the product of that description to the process which animated those descriptions. If Hippocrates describes the barbarity of the Scythians as a consequence of their climate, and if Pliny the Elder can describe incredible prodigies and rationalize these monstrosities according to geographical remove, then cartographical placement clearly serves a rhetorical function. Thus, the wandering of Ireland around its larger neighbor need not be interpreted simply as cartographical slips. Where an author places Ireland has everything to do with that author's objective in describing the place. A westerly located Ireland is Terra Tuta, a safe, sensible place and object for empire. A northerly located Ireland is Terra Periculosa, a fringe locale driven through with dangerous alterity. In the former case, the project domesticates Ireland. In the latter, the project exoticizes it. In both cases, authors are interpreting the place according to a social logic grounded in humoral considerations. That which is the furthest from the domestic core is accordingly subject to greater climactic extremes and consequently proportionally more barbarous. Now, Philip Freeman postulates that early knowledge of Ireland may have been extant in Greek language historians and geographers such as Ephorus, Pythius, and Timaeus in the 4th century, and Eratosthenes, Polybius, and Posidonius in the 3rd through 1st centuries BC. However, the fragmentary survival of their works, where and whether they survive at all, does not furnish any direct attestation. Networks of citation are tantalizingly suggestive, but wholly inconclusive regarding early knowledge of Ireland. Greek and Latin language historians and geographers whose work does demonstrate familiarity with these early authors, however, also indicate an awareness of, if not necessarily a familiarity with, Ireland. The first unambiguous attestation to Ireland appears in the 5th book of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. Having described Britain's location relative to Gaul, its shape, triangular, and its size, Caesar says, the other side of Britain inclines towards Spain in the west, in which direction is Hibernia. Smaller than Britain by 1/2, so it is thought, but the journey there is of equal length to that from Gaul to Britain. And with those spare words, Ireland enters the historical record. But what has he told us of Ireland? Caesar, according to Michel Reaux, organizes space 3 ways: geographic, strategic, and tactical, and organizes these spatial reckonings by means of perspectival scale in the author's and the narrator's proximity to it. Here, Caesar seems to be writing in a geographic mode, giving us the barest bones regarding the situation. Of course, as Andrew Rigsby notes, these 3 means of spatial reckoning need not be mutually exclusive. For Caesar, the act of describing was an artful act of encompassing within the Mediterranean consciousness. In provisioning his readers with the position and proximity, Caesar may also be speaking of its permeability. Whatever the case, Caesar is engaging in a bit of imagined geography. But Caesar has told us nothing of the residents of the place. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, offers some perceptual redress. The most savage peoples among them are those who dwell beneath the bears and on the borders of Scythia. And some of these, we're told, eat human beings, even as the Britons who dwell on Iris, as it is called. If we are to read here a very early reference to Ireland, which to be fair is not a foregone conclusion, then we might complement Caesar's imagined geography with an imagined ethnology. Now, rhetorics of cannibalism are as fraught as they are potent. And Diodorus here is treating the denizens of Iris as dastardly and barbarous and wholly beyond the purview of acceptable conduct in antiquity. Contrasting Caesar and Diodorus, we see that the former is treating Ireland neutrally, and we see the latter is treating Ireland with circumspection. With Claudius's conquest of Britannia in 43 AD, proximity and access allowed increased familiarity with Ireland and its people. Still, Roman descriptions of Ireland rely on ethnographic tropes that emphasize distinction and otherness. For instance, Pomponius Mela, a Spanish geographer of the 1st century CE, likewise weaves Ireland and its people into a tapestry of alterity. So, above Britain is Ireland, nearly equal in terms of area, but oblong on sides with respect to the sweep of its coast. Its climate is awful for the maturation of seeds, but truly luxuriant with respect to grasses, which there are not only lush, but sweet. So lush and sweet are the grasses that the livestock utterly fill themselves in a small part of the day, and unless they are barred from pasture, they burst apart from overlong feeding. Its inhabitants are crude and ignorant of all virtues to a greater degree than any other gens, and are similarly knowledgeable in matters of piety. Ireland in the Roman imagination was a place on the periphery. So alien was the place that the familiar fauna did unfamiliar things. And we might term this as zoological imagination as like an imagined menagerie, whereby the otherness of a place is complemented by the strange behavior of its animals. In Pomponius Mela's description, Ireland was northerly and especially barbarous. The former seems preconditional for the latter. Two geographers of antiquity and one encyclopedist also make reference to Ireland, Strabo and Pliny the Elder writing in the 1st century AD, and Ptolemy of Alexandria writing in the 2nd. Each make overt reference to Ireland and follow their predecessors' estimation of the land's particularity and barbarity. Strabo, while acknowledging his own reportage as hearsay, nevertheless registers his opinion. He writes, besides some small islands around Britain, there's also a large island, Ireland, which stretches parallel to Britain on the north, toward the Bears, and its breadth being greater than its length. Concerning this island, I have nothing certain to tell, except that its inhabitants are more savage than the Britons, since they are cannibals as well as gluttons, and since, further, they count it an honorable thing, when their fathers die, to devour them, and openly to have intercourse, not only with other women, but also with their mothers and sisters. But this I say, only with the understanding that I have no trustworthy witness for it. And yet, as for the matter of cannibalism, it is said to be a custom of the Scythians also, and in cases of necessity forced by sieges, the Celts, the Iberians, and several other people are said to have practiced it. Again, we see an ancient author engaging in standard ethnogeographical disparagement coupled with a northerly location. The inhabitants are intemperate and licentious. Significantly, the residents of Ireland seem to appear barbarous in proportion to their northerly remove from Strabo's Mediterranean perspective. Pliny's reference to Ireland does not divulge information about its inhabitants' customs. And on the other hand, Ptolemy, who in his Almagest calls Ireland Little Britain, gives in his Geographica detailed information about its ethnographic topography, but refrains from editorializing. Ptolemy describes 16 distinct tribes located around the Irish littoral. One, a tribe on the Irish southwest, he terms Iwernoi, an ethnonym that would furnish the word Hiberni in Latin and become the default referent to Ireland as a locale, Hibernia. Tacitus, writing at the close of the 1st century and the opening of the 2nd, refers to Ireland twice. His first reference comes in as Agricola, an encomium of his father-in-law who served as governor of Britannia between 77 and 85 AD. Agricola had been campaigning around Britain for 5 years when Tacitus notes that the governor fortified with troops the part of Britain that looks toward Hibernia in hope rather than account of fear. Hope for what exactly? Tacitus, in keeping with his penchant for laconic brevity and understatement, lets slip with the subsequent clause. For if indeed favorably situated Hibernia lies midway between Britain and Spain and is likewise situated in the Gallic Sea, then it would integrate the fairest part of the empire to the great profit of all concerned. Agricola, according to Tacitus, considers Ireland's geographical situation capable of weaving together disparate parts of the empire and locates the island in an almost southwesterly position. Tacitus continues, that is Hibernia's size, if it is compared to Britain, is smaller, but exceeds the islands of our sea, that is the Mediterranean. The soil, the weather, and the disposition and native custom of the people hardly differ much from those of Britain. We are better apprised regarding the approaches and the ports through commerce and merchants. Tacitus advances Ireland as an objective of empire, noting its geographical benefit, its commercial establishment, and by means of a topographical, ethnological comparative to Britain, its familiarity. Tacitus is domesticating Ireland. Tacitus even tells us how an invasion might look. I often heard him, that is Agricola, say that Hibernia could be battled down and occupied by one legion and a few auxiliaries, and that moreover, it could be useful against Britain. If everywhere there be Roman arms, then freedom could be banished from sight. This is an apologia for empire amid a discussion of a non-Roman place. A history of Roman Ireland could surely be written, but as Tacitus here makes plain, it would be little more than a reflex of Roman ethnic thought and praxis. He refrains from the lurid descriptions of his fellow historians and geographers precisely because he is laying onto Ireland an ideological and colonial importance. Solinus, writing in the mid-3rd century, also preserves Roman ethnic thinking about Ireland, drawing principally from Pomponius Mela and Pliny the Elder. Solinus festoons his account of Ireland with a panoply of salacious ethno-geographical thinking that casts Ireland as a foil to Roman propriety. In this place, there are no snakes, birds are rare, and the people are inhospitable and bellicose. Battle victors first swill the blood of the slain, then smear it on their faces. They regard that which is right and that which is wrong to be the same thing. Nowhere are there bees. If someone sprinkles dust or stones from that land among their honeycombs, the swarms abandon the hives. When a woman brings forth a male child, she puts its first meal on her husband's sword, on its very point, and she lightly stuffs the child's mouth with the beginning of nourishment. Then she prays barbarous vows that the child encounter no other death than one in battle under arms. Those who seek after style mark the hilts of their swords with the teeth of monstrous beasts who swim in the sea. These twinkle with the brightness of ivory. The greatest glory for the men is in the brightness of their weapons. But the sea which flows between this place and Britain is choppy and restless, and it is not navigable apart from a few days over the whole year. They sail on wickerwork boats, which they cover with a sheath of cowhide. For as long as their course holds, the sailors abstain from food. In Solinus, we encounter oddly behaved animals, barbarous people, and an inhospitable terrain building to a general condition of dangerous alterity. Solinus is the last author to attest to Ireland prior to the innovation of the term Scotus, a late Latin adoption from Brythonic that served as an enrichment of the Mediterranean ethnonymic palette, and therefore represents a kind of summation of Greek and Roman thought on the periphery of their world prior to the advent of a new descriptor. Now, from these few references to Ireland, a highly schematic picture emerges. Ireland and the Hiberni who lived there were a cipher in the Roman imagination. On the one hand, Ireland was a thoroughly atypical place. in the Greek and Roman consciousness, an exotic blank on the map at the end of the earth. The place was beyond the border. Its people did things differently and barbarously there. Its animals exploded. It was a place inscrutable and toxic. In short, it was a place like any other non-Mediterranean locale. But on the other hand, Ireland could be a place both desirable and knowable. Authors, when called to do so, could elect to render the unknown known, an exercise in colonial consciousness, whereby the wild is tamed and the previously inscrutable is made sensible. Thus, these authors dilate the Mediterranean political ambit and extend their sense of the possible into those very same blanks on the map at the ends of the earth. Naked description is the ambition of none of these authors. Greek and Roman geographers and historians could rhetorically load the place and its people with their own anxieties, desires, and objectives. Thus, in antiquity, Ireland was possessed of an imagined geography, an imagined ethnology, and an imagined menagerie. And the knowledge of this place served as a rhetorical reflex for self-definition. Far from telling us about the place itself, the appearances of Ireland and the Irish in our sources tell us about Romans and their ethnic thought, and provide us a peek into the ethnographic system of antiquity. Our authors were not only concerned with bare description, but rather also engaged in a process of assessment. Thus, the ancient image of Ireland was possessed of both a denotative dimension and a connotative dimension. The fact of this image was not necessarily commensurate with the meaning of this image, though the two were related. It seems clear that ancient authors regarded the residents of Ireland in antiquity as thoroughgoing barbarians, and authors in late antiquity could press this ethnic formation into rhetorical service during periods of political and social anxiety, which they did with abandon. Accordingly, there was an interpretative tension with regards to Ireland. When Ireland was regarded as an objective of empire, as with Caesar and Tacitus, its land and therefore its people were sensible and scrutable, and accordingly located in nearer proximity to the center of the oikoumene. When Ireland was imagined as a peripheral locale on the northern fringe of the world, as with Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, Pomponius Mela, and Silenus, its land and therefore its people were consequently depicted as barbarous and bellicose. The especial barbarity and bellicosity that attracts the images of Ireland in antiquity is reflective of Ireland's peripheral geographical placement as a Hyperborean terra ultima, the land furthest removed from the core of the Mediterranean littoral. The perceived barbarity, the authors in late antiquity were beholden to the thought ways of their more ancient predecessors. And indeed, we see that authors such as Ammianus Marcellinus, Claudian, and Jerome substantially extend the ancient discourse about Irish alterity, changing very little of this established trope of barbarity and bellicosity. Significantly, though, in the works of these authors, Ireland remains a rhetorical placeholder for extremity, an exotic Ausland that was savage and barbarous in proportion to its remove from the Mediterranean metropole. Even despite an obvious shift in the ethnonym of its denizens in the 4th century, a new descriptor emerges that alleges to index Irishness, Scotus. Now, Scotus is a totally conventional, late Latin, second declension masculine noun, and we are privileged to its use in its full paradigm. Undoubtedly, Scotus suggests itself to be an ethnonym. The first entry lemma for Scotus in the Dictionary of Medieval Latin from British sources is Gaelic-speaking inhabitant of Ireland, Irishman. And the origins of this term, however, are famously shrouded in mystery. The ethnonym Scotus is almost certainly drawn from a Celtic language, likely from Brythonic, but almost certainly not from Goidelic itself. The etymon that furnished this word originally meant something like shady character or knifesman, likely the former. The word Scotus emerged into Latin fully formed. It referred to a group and had no other meaning. In words adapted from Patrick Amory, late antique use of classical ethnographic ideologies, especially in propaganda, literature, and history, created the Scoti of the Middle Ages. As we shall see, late antique references to Ireland in substance serve to carry forward the ethnic thinking of ancient geographers and ethnographers. Little did they innovate, and little did they diverge from the precedent established by their forebears. From a functional standpoint, Ireland served as a reference point for extremity. Whenever authors felt rhetorically compelled to reach for an example at the ends of the earth, to imagine the edges of the map, they found the Irish example ready to hand. Scolti come to occupy the imagination of Latin authors in the later 4th and early 5th centuries, carrying forward ancient ethnographic discourses on alterity and exoticism. The semantic field of Scotus as a lexeme was riddled through with images of savagery, bellicosity, and barbarism. Now, the earliest mention of the ethnonym Scotus occurs in the peculiar and reticent Laterculus Veronensis. The text is a bare-bones periplus of the Roman provinces after Diocletian's division of the empire in 293. The provinces described in the text allow us to refine a date range for its composition. Though the sole manuscript witness to the Laterculus Veronensis dates to the early 7th century, Theodore Mommsen argues that the text appeared very soon after 297, and consensus now argues for a multi-stage composition prior to 324. The anonymous author tells us that among the barbarian gentes, which have sprouted under the emperors, are the Scoti. If the arguments of Mommsen and others obtained, then this hand list is the early example of the ethnonym Scotus. The new term represents an enrichment of the ethnological palette of the Roman sense for the North, and may perhaps signal a greater mobility on the part of the Scoti themselves, or rather, a greater sensitivity on the part of our authors to presences beyond the Roman limites. Why the word Scotus came to supplant the previous identifier Hibernus and its analogs, and when it did, is probably unknowable. But after its first attested usage, the word Scotus begins to appear with some regularity, always referring to Irish raiders and carrying no ulterior connotation apart from its palette of barbarity. Thanks to the work of Ammianus Marcellinus, a Greek and formerly a soldier who wrote in Latin his Res Gestae in Rome sometime between 378 and 391, we are provisioned to imagine where the word Scotus appeared and thus tentatively propose the circumstances of its adoption and proliferation. Ammianus tells us that in 360 in Britain, the raids of the Scoti and the Picts, ferocious gentes, devastated the places near the borders. The Scoti and the Picts had broken the brokered peace. Fear riddled the provinces, which were wearied by a heap of prior beatings. Emperor Julian the Apostate, who at this time was passing the winter of his 3rd consulship in Paris, dispatched Lupicinus, who was then Magister Armorum, to address the incursion, as Julian preferred to remain in Gaul, watchful of the Alemanni. We are not favored with the resolution of this episode. Julian later suspected Lupicinus of treachery and recalled him from Britain, though Lupicinus did serve as consul in 367 after Julian's death in Mesopotamia. A little later, both in time and narrative, Ammianus tells us, at this time, as if the clarion blast sounded with the singing of the war horns, the most savage gentes throughout the whole Roman world were roused and were ranging across the border nearest to them. The provinces of Gaul and Rhaetia were plundered by the Alemanni, the Pannonias by the Sarmati and the Quadi, while the Picts, the Saxons, and the Scoti and the Atticoti vexed the Britons with continual calamities. A few observations speak to Ammianus's characterization of the Scoti. First, preserved are previous authors' references to barbaric ferocity. Ammianus's usage here of formulations like gens fera and gens saevissima echoes the previous derogations of the Irish in antiquity. Recall, Diodorus Siculus calls the Irish the most savage people. Pomponius Mela says they are crude and ignorant of all virtues to a greater degree than any other gens, and are similarly knowledgeable in matters of piety. Strabo says that Ireland's inhabitants are more savage than the Britons. Ammianus seems to be perpetuating a controlling image of the Irish as hyperbolically savage. Second, the Scoti were capable of sowing fear to the degree that a peace treaty would seem preferable to a show of force, but were prone to violating these agreements. Owing to the perdition of Ammianus's first 14 books, we cannot know the terms of this treaty, but the fact of a treaty and Ammianus's surprise at its violation speak to the timorous conditions in Britannia in the 4th century. Finally, Ammianus's admission that the British provinces had been wearied from previous beatings indicates a baleful state of affairs and the precarious position of public safety and liminal integrity. But more than these, this episode makes clear that Ammianus regarded the Scoti as treacherous and duplicitous, quite in keeping with Irish barbarity suggested by previous authors. Ammianus is trading in established ethnographic tropes. But the Hiberni of old bear a new moniker. The question is why? In the face of predations and depredations, the affected populations added a word from their own vernacular to the late Latin lexicon in order to describe their new situation. The Brythonic-speaking people most immediately affected by the incursions of the Scoti in 360 were precisely those whose language furnished a ready-made descriptor for the interlopers. If indeed Brythonic is the language that supplied this new ethnographical technology of description, we should be unsurprised. After all, the semantic field that attended the word in Brythonic, the ghoulishness of the raiders, the dark ones, would certainly fit with the experience of sudden and complete affright. But the events of 360 are a prelude to the explosion of Scoti onto the Roman consciousness. In no fewer than 3 separate events, invasions of Scoti burst rudely onto the Roman scene, likely hastening the withdrawal of Roman imperial power in Britain. The Conspiratio Barbarica of 367, the military action of Maximus in 382-383, and an intervention of Stilicho against the seaborne raiders from among the ranks of the Scoti in 398-399. Each subsequently magnified the horror and depredation of the latter. I would like now to turn and skip just a little bit. I had a discussion prepared of Claudian, but I want to get to Jerome. So the Scoti of our late antique authors featured the full suite of Roman ethnographic commonplaces, the barbarity, duplicity, ferocity, etc. Accordingly, the historians and poets of late antiquity could demand the hand of order to allay their anxieties and make actionable their desire for stability. Still, while we lack any dimensional perspective on the place or its people, the experience of depredation and incursion was voiced by a new descriptor, our Scotus. Christian authors, too, made reference to Scoti that signaled awareness of the ethnic category and a willingness to engage in Latinate ethnic discourse. Christian authors preserved the imaginative suite of pagan historians and geographers of antiquity regarding Ireland and the barbarous Irish as outside the Christian body politic. Scoti appear in the work of Jerome, whose ethnic thinking about them really perpetuates the antique discourse on their alterity, using much the same terms. Jerome characterizes the Scoti largely identically to his Greek and Latin language forebears, which is to say that their every mention across his massive corpus of writings and translations is pejorative. In no small way, Jerome defined the terms of the intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages, but what precisely did he innovate? If the example of the Scoti in his ethnic thought is any indication, Jerome's contribution to ethnic discourse is less one of innovation and more one of translation. He carried the ethnic discourse of antiquity into the Christianized discourse of late antiquity. And Jerome seasoned his ethical thought with ethnic examples. Writing against Jovianus, an anti-ascetic Christian monk, Jerome employs established tropes to emphasize the alterity of the Scoti. Why should I speak of other nations when I myself as a youth in Gaul saw the Atticoti or the Scoti, a Britannic gens, gorge on human flesh? Even when they come upon flocks of swine, cattle, or sheep in the forests, it is their custom to cut off the buttocks of the shepherd and the breasts of the women, and these they judge the most delicious of meals. The nation of the Scoti has no wives of their own, and as if they read Plato's Republic and follow the example of Cato, no one among them has a wife of his own, but they run riot in the manner of beasts, doing whatever they please. Jerome's allegedly first-hand encounter of cannibalism and sexual license ought to arrest our attention. While evidence for his testimony is lacking, he does seem to be trading in established derogative tropes of barbarism, especially as they pertain to the Irish specifically. Remember, Diodorus Siculus alleges that the Irish eat human beings. Strabo maintains that they are cannibals as well as gluttons. The matter of sexual license, too, might best be read as a stereotype of barbarism or as an early Christian reflex of Christian sexual anxieties. Jerome is deploying tropes of cannibalism and sexual licentiousness in a rhetorical fashion. Jerome's implication is that the object of this invective, Jovianus, is no better than a barbarian. Now, Jerome mentions the Scoti usually in refutations of Pelagianism, decreed heretical by the Council of Carthage in 418. Pelagius was a Romano-British theologian who denied the doctrine of original sin and who taught that God's grace could be freely elected. And there is, as Todd Bertzon has indicated, a discursive consonance between late antique imaginings of heresy and antique ethnographic literature. In Jerome's imagination, at least, there seems to be some connection between the Scoti and Pelagius's aberrant heretical doctrine. In the prologue of the first book of his commentary on Jeremiah, really a screed denouncing Pelagius and his teaching, Jerome refers to his opponents as fattened with the porridge of the Scoti. In the prologue of the third book of the same work, Jerome makes overt reference to the followers of Pelagius. The devil, himself silent, barks through the dog of Albion, both full-grown and well-bodied, who is able to range forth more on account of its foot pads than on account of its teeth. For his progeny is among the Scotic gentes, from the neighborhood of the Britons, who, like Cerberus in the fables of the poets, must be beaten with a spiritual club, along with his master Pluto, so that he might hold his tongue in eternal silence. And the dog of Albion here, of course, is Pelagius himself, whose message spreads physically by coercion, that is on foot, rather than by conviction, that is through teeth, through oratory. The alterity of the Scoti remains, but the discourse underpinning that alterity shifts. With the universalizing impulse of Christianity, ethnic thought was increasingly termed and voiced in terms of orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Thus, it is fair to say that while Jerome did not give voice to new ethnic thinking in his massive corpus, he nevertheless preserved the ethnographic palette of antiquity for medieval Christian consumption. Just as the semantic field persists when the ethnonymic reference to Ireland shifts from Hibernus to its analogues to Scotus, when the organizing interpretive apparatus shifts from discourses dominated by Roman civic polytheism to those organized according to a Christian framework, Scoti remain thoroughly enmeshed in a discourse of barbarism. Of course, as with all Roman ethnic thought, references to Scoti tell us more about the malignant narcissism of Roman ethnographers than it does about the ostensible object of this ethnic thinking. Thus, the discursive field of Roman ethnic thought tells us more about Roman anxieties, fears, desires, and hopes than it does about the people it putatively describes. The same could be said about Latinate Christian authors laboring under the categories of belonging inherited from pre-Christian antiquity. Now, if the argument of the foregoing has any merit, then the confusion about the location of Ireland evinced in the works of ancient ethnic thinkers has less to do with cartographical uncertainty and rather more to do with the rhetorical ambitions of the author. Likewise, the late antique authors who carried forward this ethnic discourse, now armed with a new ethnonym to describe an old villain, equally pressed the Irish into the service of their rhetorical ambitions. Each of these authors have engaged in what Alexander O'Hara and I have termed perception events, moments at which an ethnic group is noticed and incorporated into the human terrain of the perceiver. In moments such as those described above, The ethnicities are constructed, configured, and deployed as instruments in the furtherance of myriad ambitions. I thank you very much for your time.